Welcome to the To Be the Church podcast, where we explore what it looks like to truly be the church in today's culture. Tyler, Andrew here. You need to be watching on YouTube as opposed to just listening in your podcast app, because if you're not watching on YouTube, you have no idea why we just stopped and giggled like little girls for...
I didn't giggle. You giggled.
You should rewind 15 seconds and see that Andrew, in fact, did giggle as well. But yeah, Andrew and Tyler here. It is Friday. As this comes out, it is Friday, September 24th. And yeah, a lot going on in our world, in our church. Man, what a great couple weeks here at NGC. 19 folks getting baptized.
Yep.
Fall has kicked off, new sermon series in the book of Judges. If you go to NGC and you haven't listened to our episode on why we would preach Judges, go back and listen to that episode from August, I believe. It was a really fun overview of why we do this, and why we are preaching through this book of the Bible. Andrew, on Judges, did I hear correctly that you may be doing your doctoral dissertation on Judges and Jesus?
Yeah.
Or is that
Judge Jesus? Preaching Christ from Judges. Yeah, I actually just sent out an email this morning to one of my professors to find out if he could, approve that.
Nice.
And be a part of it. So we'll see. I don't know. Maybe.
Yeah, that'll be a good one, I'm sure. Will this become your first book, you think? I mean, dissertation, pretty much a book anyway. So.
Yeah, but I mean, people have to want to read it for it to become a book.
So. You know what? I've written 3 novels, and I can tell you for certain that is not true.
So we'll see.
Yeah. Okay, so let's jump right in. Have a lot of questions. We could go over some follow-ups on the Mars Hill stuff that we talked about last week, and the Mars Hill story that's still coming out every couple of weeks through the Rise and Fall of Mars Hill podcast, stuff like that. We could talk more about civil disobedience, but let's take this one today. Here's a question that came in from a listener. Recently, my wife and I have been doing a lot of research on the vaccine, the new mandate, and the place of a Christian in all this. This leads us back to 1527 when Martin Luther wrote on the plague and the role of that Christians have to care for the community around them. We've seen a lot of Christians act as if this mandate is the end of the world, quoting things about, quote, not living in fear, or, quote, not being controlled, or even some family who believes this to be the mark of the beast. We, on the other hand, believe modern medicine to be from God, that the brilliance and intelligence of those who create life-saving medicine is a spiritual gift in its own. Now, we have a newborn baby, and interactions with people outside our household look very different right now than they normally would. As we wrestle through tough decisions and ground rules for the safety of our child, we would love to hear your thoughts regarding Martin Luther's letter, primarily places like the following. So this is from Martin Luther in 1527. He says, others sin on the right hand. I'll talk about the left hand here in a minute after we read the question. Others sin on the right hand. They are much too rash and reckless, tempting God and disregarding everything which might counteract death and the plague. They disdain the use of medicines. They do not avoid places and persons infected by the plague, but lightheartedly make sport of it and wish to prove how independent they are. They say that it is God's punishment. If he wants to protect them, he can do so without medicines or our carefulness. That is not trusting God, but tempting him. Later in the Luther quote, he says this, no, my dear friends, that is no good. Use medicine, take potions which can help you, fumigate house, yard, and street, shun persons and places where your neighbor does not need your presence or has recovered, and act like a man who wants to help put out the burning city. What else is the epidemic but a fire which instead of consuming wood and straw devours life and body? You ought to think this way. Very well, by God's decree, the enemy has sent us poison and deadly offal. Awful. OFFAL.
So awful.
Therefore, I shall ask God mercifully to protect us. Then I shall fumigate, help purify the air, administer medicine, and take it. I shall avoid persons and places where my presence is not needed in order not to become contaminated and thus, perchance, infect and pollute others, and so cause their death as a result of my negligence. If God should wish to take me, he will surely find me, and I have done what he has expected of me, and so I am not responsible for either my own death or the death of others. If my neighbor needs me, however, I shall not avoid place or person, but will go freely, as stated above. See, this is such a God-fearing faith, because it is neither brash nor foolhardy and does not tempt God. And so when I read this quote for the first time just a few minutes ago, I was like, okay, others sin on the right hand. So oftentimes when people send in a question and they just say, well, here's the second part of the argument, I like want to know what's on that other hand, you know?
Yeah.
And so I went and found that full quote. And on the left hand, he's talking about showing Christian hospitality and care for those who are sick, and being willing to step into the lives of those who have been infected with the plague, you know, and being a Christian witness there as kind of an argument of what you do for the least of these, you do for me.
So if we're going to summarize it, we've got Luther writing on the plague in 1527 in Germany, and he says he's basically cautioning Christians against kind of swinging the pendulum too far in one direction, maybe?
Yeah.
On the right hand, he's saying,
don't be foolish and like, he talks about modern medicine. Yeah, don't tempt God by just saying, I'm not going to take medicine because God has this in control.
Okay.
And then on the other hand, he's saying, don't be so careful that you don't care for others practically. Okay. Don't be so scared of this thing that you don't take care of the person in need around you.
Okay. So kind of maybe don't be selfish on either side, right? Don't be selfish by just kind of, you know, that, and then by throwing off all science, right? All like modern medicine, which in 1527 I'm sure was amazing, and you know,
involved a lot of fumigation apparently,
a lot of bloodletting, and then don't on the other side cower in fear to it, or maybe even utilize it as an excuse to not love your neighbor, right? Mm-hmm. Okay, cool.
Yeah,
interesting. So there was a link at the bottom of that question, where as I'm scrolling through it, I think the Luther quotes and that kind of stuff were taken out of Christianity Today article back on May 19th, 2020. Okay, so title of the article is Martin Luther, Whether One May Flee from a Deadly Plague.
Yeah, so I think it's not even an article. I think it is just the letter from Luther to Reverend Dr. Johann Hess in 1527.
There you go.
So
cool.
Yeah, as I looked through it, I didn't see any and here's what that means. It's more, here's the letter.
Oh, cool. So that's May 2020 that was released. So and the question asker here is saying, what was the actual question in here? I don't see any.
Just love to hear your thoughts regarding the letter.
Okay.
Thoughts regarding the letter as it relates to the COVID-19 vaccination. They say in here, have a newborn baby, interaction with people outside our house are very different than they would as we wrestle through these tough decisions and ground rules for the safety of our child. We'd love your thoughts.
So maybe we synthesized all the thoughts there by saying the question is kind of like, how do we, to take it into our vernacular of this podcast, how do we be the church in light of the current situation with COVID and everything, vaccines, and then even having friends or community members or whoever that maybe have different responses or different opinions on how they would go about it, right? So how do we be the church?
Yeah, we've seen a lot of Christians act as mandates at the end of the world, quoting things about not living in fear, not being controlled, and have some family members who believe this to be the mark of the beast.
Yeah.
Like the vaccine specifically.
Cool. Yeah, if it is, you definitely don't want it, right?
If it is the mark of the beast,
for sure, dude. Okay, so yeah, I think what are your initial thoughts, Ty?
I was just hoping you'd answer this one and I could just sit and listen, but
okay.
No, I think. Well, I would say this. I would say that I understand. The struggle, the wrestling with this right now.
Yeah.
From this question asker, I'm talking about having a new baby, and how do I interact? And I think I answered a lot of these questions in community with people around me toward the beginning of the pandemic. How do I interact in a healthy, biblical way with those who are treating this pandemic differently than I am?
Yep.
Specifically, I have some friends who legit had a COVID bubble, and there was 8 people that they hung out with, and those 8 people did not hang out with anyone else because none of them were comfortable hanging out with anybody that they didn't know was taking it as seriously as they were.
A COVID clique.
Yeah, and so they were pod is I think the official word they were using. It's their pod of people. And
ooh, nice. Okay.
Legit for 5 months.
On a pod, dude.
For 5 months, and they were serious about this. For 5 months, they didn't interact in person for more than 15 minutes with anyone who wasn't a part of that 8%.
Was that like early on, like in 2020?
Yeah, that was kind of when it all went down and people weren't going to work and stuff like that. And so I think that'd be much more difficult to do today with the world open back up and stuff, But so you have people like that, and then you have other people who are like, there's a comedian who says like half my friends, are very, very they're too cautious. And then the other half are out here acting like they're trying to get COVID. Yeah. And so like you have that side of it too, where it's just like, they're out there looking for it. And so I get the tension is what like, I think my overall first reaction to this. It's interesting to look at historical events and try to say like this applies directly to what we're going through today.
Yeah.
And so like I don't know the history. I mean, based on your history of terrorism a couple weeks ago, maybe you do know the history of the plague that was happening in 1527, what that actually looked like. Apparently fumigation was one of the ways that they dealt with it. I don't know. Yeah. But so I'd want a lot more context on the situation Luther was in before I was like wholeheartedly saying, and this specifically applies to exactly what we're dealing with today. Yeah. But I also don't want to discount it just because the scenario is different too. I'd want to, figure out that.
Yeah. And that's where my thoughts go, Ty. I think that like, because throughout the pandemic, and it's appropriate too. I think that article from Christianity Today was May 2020. That's over a year ago. It's and you did see a lot of stuff like that coming out in April and May of 2020 because very early on, and we talked about this on a podcast last week maybe or the week before. Very early on, like we knew very little about. We knew it was a novel coronavirus. We knew this was like a new coronavirus, that it wasn't something that had been seen before in humans, and so that all the health establishments and everybody were like warning us of that, and so everybody was like, okay, what is this, right? And so by May 19th, 2020, stuff in certain states had started to kind of open up again. You remember, everything shut down in March through April, but then by May of 2020, I mean even here, I think it was probably a week after that our Camas site opened up, right? Early June, right?
Yeah, I think.
And then
right.
we did here at East Vancouver like mid to late June.
Yeah, the 28th.
So it's like that. By May 19th, there was starting to be sort of the, and you certainly see it like in the political world, like the back and forth on like, okay, there's more known about this now, and we're gonna. I think there was certainly some states, and I'm just speaking from an American standpoint, who are going to kind of trial and error this thing a little bit to see like, okay, what happens when we open up a little bit more. And if you look internationally, you see nations like Sweden who were sort of the guinea pig for all of this because they never did the lockdown stuff early on and just kind of got their population through it, in that way. So I think like early on, there was a ton of articles like that. I remember 9 Marks coming out with something. Obviously, you had the Christianity Today there, and just the stuff that I'm normally in have an eye on as it relates to kind of Christians, what Christians are reading in our evangelical world in America. Like there was a lot of pieces like that. The Spanish flu, right? I remember Mark Dever and them talking about like the precedent for not meeting during the Spanish flu in America, right? And so this one with Luther goes back to the plague. And here's an article from ChristianHistoryInstitute.org. And this is talking about the bubonic plague, also known as the Black Death, the Black Death was a different disease a couple centuries earlier, but 1527 it's the bubonic plague, and one of the key things in that is it the bubonic plague killed 30% or more of the population wherever it broke out, and so and so I think my first and knowing. Even though I wasn't sure the exact plague that Luther was referring to when we first read the question, it didn't take long to look that up and see what he was referring to as this pestilence, right? And I know as it relates to the Spanish flu of the early 20th century, my short answer, or my first thought after talking for like 19 minutes on this is like, this is not that, and I think at the same time that we want to be intellectually honest when it comes to stuff like science, right? Like modern medicine and the vaccines, which have proven so far to be pretty effective from everything we've seen, right? And like we've talked about it before on this podcast, total issue of conscience for you, right? And so if it violates your conscience to get the vaccine, that doesn't mean you need to call it the mark of the beast, right? Mm-hmm. You don't need to create this theological bubble for yourself to prove that your personal conscience and your opinion is what God would say, right? You can just say, that violates my conscience. I don't think that'd be the best thing to do. And then on the other side of it, you don't want to go, hey, because I'm more pro-vaccine, or I think everybody should get it, or I'm on this side of the political aisle, basically anybody who doesn't want to do that is a science denier. Well, that's not true either, right? So I think to be the church in this, you've got to be not only, scientifically aware and honest and humble in that, but also historically honest. And that Christianity Today article from May 2020, it was at that time, you read it, and there's still some of those comparisons going on. I haven't seen many of those comparisons in recent days, a few people maybe, but this is not that. The COVID-19 deal, even though it can be very serious for some people, by and large, it's not, even though it's got the name pandemic, and we might want to compare it to previous pandemics or whatever else, and I'm not saying it's not a pandemic. I don't make those choices of who, CDC or WHO or whoever.
You're not an epidemiologist?
I'm not, but or
I thought we all were now,
or a policymaker, but at the same time, I think you've got to look at it and go, if this was the pestilence, right? If this was the plague, there would have. I mean, let's just round down and say there's 300 million people in America. Can you do the quick math? What's 30% of that?
Yeah.
30 million, so 90 million people. So no, if you haven't been keeping track, this has not killed 90 million people in America, and so or anywhere, and in fact, it's not that. It's not the Spanish flu. I've seen a thing recently talking about George Washington, he forced the Continental Army in the Revolutionary War to get smallpox vaccinations, so the government should force everybody to get them. And you're like, okay. So, and you got to look at that historically too to say, okay, this isn't smallpox, number one. Number two, you also don't apply to general citizens what you would apply to the chain of command and the hierarchy that would be in a military, right? So he can and should have commanded that as he did for his soldiers, because it was decimating them at Valley Forge during the Revolutionary War, but during that one winter. But again, so the one-to-one correspondence, and a lot of it's the frustrating thing I think that can happen is a lot of the arguments that we have in our sort of cable news world, where and our social media world are they're just very, very narrow, and kind of surfacey, and they're just sort of talking points arguments, right? And so I would say to be but if I say this back, then then I'll win the argument, And I think to be the church, we should research these things. We should think through them logically. We should be humble about it, and then we should go into this because I do think at this point, a couple of years in now, the comparisons of this to those historic plagues is just not really a good comparison. If you want to compare it to swine flu, which was a recent thing that we had here 10 years ago or so in America, that would probably be a pretty apt comparison. That wasn't as transmissible. But it was more. It was. I think it was. It might have been more deadly, but it certainly affected children more. And that's the big one that you see now. And the important thing to be aware of is like nationally and politically right now. The big thing is the kids are all going to die if we don't do all these things. And again, it's just not really a scientific thing. It's not affecting children, thank God, in the way even the flu is. And so. So I think that's something to be aware of, and so that would be my response to it. Is just as you're studying the science, study also the history as you're, and then just because someone swings the pendulum really far one direction, doesn't mean it needs to bounce back the other direction in the way that we handle things, right? So,
yeah, it's interesting. I'm thinking through like let's say you're the person with a newborn who, obviously this question's coming from
pregnant. I've seen a lot of people who are pregnant that are also
and like they're coming from the angle of like, hey, get the vaccine.
Sure.
And then I'm thinking through like maybe a family member of that person who is like, that is not for me.
Sure.
I think there needs to be grace on both sides.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
Because both sides are going to think they're right, obviously, or they wouldn't be on that side. And so
I like to be on the wrong side of history, mainly.
Well, we'll see.
I just like to say things that make Cody laugh, and then I can look at him and he's laughing.
But I think that grace and humility are needed on both sides.
Yeah.
Like I would say that if you in your conscience truly believe like my child should not be around people who aren't taking this seriously, like
Sure.
my newborn specifically,
or as seriously as
as seriously
you
as I
feel
think they should,
yeah.
like that is your right, and I think you need to handle that with grace.
Yeah.
If you were on the other end of that spectrum and you were maybe an aunt or uncle or a grandparent or a sibling or something like that, and you're sitting here and like my left wing kid or nephew won't let me see his baby because like he's been duped by the vaccine news or whatever.
Sure. Yeah.
Like I think you need a lot of grace and humility as well to say like, hey, like they are truly trying to do what they believe is best for their child and for their family, and that grace is needed there. And I think if both sides come to the table with that level of humility and grace, that things will work out, and that you'll figure out, okay, like here's a way that we can circumvent this. I think when you come to it with hostility and like they're just stupid, or they're all they're doing is tempting God, or all they're doing is giving into the mark of the beast, or whatever.
Sure.
Like all you're going to do is set up that whole conversation for failure, and it'll never get to a point where. And I think that those conversations in humility and grace go a really long way.
And I think of it too, like, again, we're talking about being the church here, and in being the church and being a Christian, like you've got to think of the fruit, Ty, like that idea of fruit, and the idea of the teaching of Christ and all that He's commanded us, and loving one another. And I was just looking today in preparation for a member meeting we're having next week, like all the one another statements in the New Testament, and people have numbered them different ways, but about 59, 60 one another statements from Jesus or from the apostles. And as you read through those, in the way that we are to live as Christians with one another and in this world, I think that like it's that's a better source for you as you're thinking through these things and praying through how trying to inform your conscience, trying to inform how you would respond to friends, family members who feel differently than you on this. That's a better source than like the clickbaity, news personalities or whatever, who are just going to entrench you further in your side of the aisle or your talking points or whatever. And so I just think making sure that and if there is divisiveness, and if there are things that aren't fitting those one another commands among believers, that's where we got to look and go, okay, like we've talked about this before, like what volumes do I have turned up in my life and what volumes do I have turned down, right? Like, and adjusting the knobs of those things if you find that you're really entrenched, right, in your own opinion. You just cannot get through that, because the crazy thing about, and this is part of the kind of the civil religion in America, and I read a book a couple summers ago on American history and civil religion, and it like walked through how biblical language was appropriated basically since way before the founding, and it started with kind of the city on a hill idea in like the 1600s, and all the way through, and it had presidents from George Washington to Abraham Lincoln to Franklin Roosevelt to Barack Obama, like, and how they appropriated that kind of language, and it's very, very, very common in America, both sides of the aisle, the left and the right. Nearly every politician does this, where they appropriate biblical language to basically prove that their policy or whatever is the correct thing. And I've seen so much of that in this, right? In the COVID thing, that like loving your neighbor, or Jesus said to do this, or this virtue, I've seen like on the right, people go like, well, no, because I'm not going to bear false witness. So I'm not going to do this because it's actually not that serious, or, so there's just that language appropriated. And it's funny because it's like virtuous biblical language appropriated to prove that I'm right. It's just like, it's not really, you look at that and go, not really what that is meaning there. So yeah, I think that, and dude, one other thing that comes to mind is this idea that unfortunately, and this is a real frustrating thing that you see right now from the public health establishment in America and from the policy, even like the idea of the vaccine mandates, whatever you may think of those. What's not being talked about is antibodies that people have when they've had the virus, and there are actually studies that are coming out internationally on this. Unfortunately, in America, we're not doing a lot of these studies, but there's studies coming out internationally that like if you've had COVID, the level of protection that you have both from getting it or from spreading it is just tremendously greater than if you've gotten the vaccine. And so I think that's another thing to keep in mind. Do your research on that. And unfortunately, that's like a pretty basic scientific thing on viruses that is just for one reason or another not really being talked about on the policy side of things. And so, like instead of mandating vaccines, and this shouldn't really be controversial, I don't think. Like a better policy would be testing people for antibodies, and if they have the antibody to it, that they would not need to take the vaccine, because it's like they're actually more protected. And so, but again, the policymakers right now aren't thinking those ways and aren't really talking. I mean, some of them are talking about it, but it's, and so those things to think about. And and I'm just thinking about like young parents or those kind of things when you're thinking about your kids, like being aware of what the danger actually is or isn't, and being responsible in how you handle that. So important stuff.
Yeah. I like that, statement to look to Scripture, like before you look to news outlets.
Yeah.
You could say like,
and more frequently too.
Yeah. You could say instead of Hannity, go to Hebrews. Right?
Now you got to do something
instead
on the
of
left.
Anderson Cooper, go to Colossians. Cooper to Colossians.
I like it. Yeah, that's great, man. Cooper to Colossians. There's your title there.
Yeah. Well, hit us up if you have questions that you'd like us to discuss, maybe about this or anything really. Podcast at toBeTheChurch.com is the way to do that. And I'm really frustrated with myself because here in about 15 minutes, I'm going to think of the best. The best wordplay for, somebody like, I was like, Glenn Galatian, I don't know. But so, anyway, hit us up on social media. Like we said at the beginning, if you're not watching this on YouTube, you can watch this instead of listen to it. And we encourage you to do so. But until next week, be the church.